Hello, Real Talk is here. An experienced lighthouse keeper arrives at a desolate island with his ambitious young assistant to take over from the previous watchman. From the get-go, tension and rivalry build between the two. The isolation, constant fog, storms, and endless shifts slowly drive them both to the brink of madness. Hallucinations, strange noises, and bizarre events blur the line between reality and fantasy.
Ain't you never been to sea before? Back, I says, back!
The film opens with the eerie sound of a foghorn cutting through the thick mist. A ship slices through the foamy waves, and on its bow stand two men, staring into the darkness pierced by flashes of light from the lighthouse. These are the new keepers, the main characters. The grizzled veteran, Thomas Wake, and his fresh-faced assistant, Ephraim Winslow. After rowing ashore with their supplies, they trudge up the island's steep slopes toward the lighthouse, passing the previous keepers on their way out. The ship that brought them here for a 4-week shift fades into the fog with one last blast of its horn. Inside the lighthouse, the younger man takes in his surroundings. He stumbles upon a locked cabinet and tries the door, but it doesn't budge. Later, he heads upstairs to the attic, which doubles as their sleeping quarters. After setting up his mattress, Ephraim sits on the bed, only to find a small wooden mermaid figure hidden inside a tear in the fabric. He pockets it without a second thought. Soon after, he gets to work, shoveling coal into the furnace that powers the lighthouse. That evening, they sit down to dinner. Thomas pours some whiskey into a cup and raises it in a toast. Ephraim refuses at first, but the old man insists, it's bad luck not to toast. Ephraim tries to mention that drinking is against the rules, but Thomas, being the one in charge, commands him to pour himself a drink and toast along. When Ephraim finally gives in and takes a drink, Thomas lays out the rest of their duties. All the heavy, dirty work falls squarely on the rookie, while Thomas will manage the light itself. Ephraim clearly doesn't like this arrangement, but what can he do? He seethes as he shovels more coal into the furnace. Meanwhile, Thomas climbs to the top of the lighthouse, staring into the blinding light as if in a trance, stripping down and raising his cup to the lamp in a bizarre ritual. One night, Ephraim steps outside, gazing out at the ocean, mesmerized by the shimmering moonlit path across the water. Suddenly, he notices logs drifting toward the shore, and something else. A body. He wades into the water, trying to reach it, but it's too deep. He dives, and just as he gets closer, a mermaid appears from the depths. Startled, Ephraim wakes up in his bed, realizing it was just a dream. The next morning, Thomas finishes his night shift and heads to bed after giving Ephraim his orders for the day. Ephraim spends the day toiling around the lighthouse, doing the heavy lifting. As he hauls coal for the furnace, a seagull confronts him, bold as brass, showing no fear. Ephraim has to throw a rock at the bird to scare it off. Unbeknownst to him, Thomas watches from the lighthouse's lookout. Later, Ephraim struggles to lug a heavy oil barrel up the lighthouse's spiral staircase to lubricate the lamp's rotating mechanism. When he finally reaches the top, Thomas hands him an oil canister, casually suggesting that he use it next time instead of dragging the whole barrel up. The old man forbids Ephraim from approaching the lamp again, accusing him of laziness and even questioning his intelligence. At dinner, Thomas repeats a poetic toast, and this time, Ephraim, learning from past experiences, no longer refuses to drink. After a few sips, the old man tries to engage the younger one in conversation, but Ephraim isn't in the mood for chatting. Thomas starts reminiscing about his past. He used to be a sailor until he broke his leg. Ephraim asks what happened to the last assistant, and it turns out the previous guy went mad. He hallucinated mermaids, and the lighthouse's light seemed to hypnotize him. The old man mentions that he saw Ephraim chase away a seagull and warns him never to harm seabirds. It's a terrible omen. Ephraim scoffs at this, which sends Thomas into a rage. The next day, Thomas scolds Ephraim again, accusing him of not cleaning the quarters properly. Ephraim protests, claiming he had cleaned twice, but the place is so old and decrepit that nothing seems to help. The old man threatens to dock Ephraim's pay if he doesn't follow orders without question. With no other choice, Ephraim complies and starts doing whatever Thomas tells him. The old man tails him with a logbook, noting his every move. It's only when they're outside, and rain is pouring down in sheets, that Thomas gives him some space. That night, dinner passes in complete silence. The following day, Ephraim paints the outside walls of the lighthouse. Thomas is lowering him by a pulley but loses control, and Ephraim falls from a height, briefly losing consciousness. When he comes to, a seagull is pecking at his leg, and it takes a few moments to shoo the bird away. Back in the house, Ephraim catches the old man writing in his logbook before locking it in a cupboard. At dinner that evening, Ephraim pours drinks for both of them. He finally introduces himself. Until this point, the old man didn't even know his name. They realize they're halfway through their shift, with 2 more weeks to go. Ephraim shares a bit about his past. He used to be a lumberjack in Canada, floating logs downriver. He took the lighthouse gig to save up some money. Remote island work pays better. The next few days go by in monotonous, back-breaking work. Ephraim is so exhausted that he struggles to sleep and decides to sneak up to the lamp at night. But Thomas is already there, keeping watch. Ephraim freezes on the final steps, staring through the grates at the light. But instead of legs, he sees something strange, slime dripping down and massive tentacles slithering near the lamp. It's the second to last day, and a ship is supposed to arrive tomorrow, signaling the end of their shift. But once again, a seagull pesters Ephraim. This time, he catches the bird and kills it violently. You could interpret this act as Ephraim trying to suppress his desire for freedom, submitting instead to the rules and isolation dictated by Thomas and the island. Right after, the wind suddenly changes direction from west to north. The weather vane on the lighthouse spins like it's been magnetized. Later, Thomas mentions that it's the calm before the storm. If they don't manage to leave the island by morning, they're in for a rough time. The old man orders Ephraim to board up the windows. Afterward, they check their lobster traps and find a few big catches. Over dinner, they drink again. It's their last night before the shift change. After all, no harm in indulging. One drink leads to another, and soon they're singing old sea shanties, pouring their hearts out, laughing, and nearly coming to blows. For the first time, Thomas reveals his real name. Ephraim, in turn, tells him about his days floating logs and how his old boss used to humiliate him, just like Thomas does now. The next morning, Ephraim wakes up on the floor, just like Thomas. Staggering, he goes to dump the contents of the chamber pots. As he goes about his usual tasks, waiting for the ship to arrive, he hauls coal for the furnace. On one of his trips to the shore, he notices a body tangled in seaweed. Rushing over, Ephraim discovers it's a pale woman, but not just any woman. Below her waist are gills and a tail. The mermaid awakens and mocks him with a screeching voice, like the cry of seagulls. Terrified, Ephraim runs, screaming in fear. He bursts into the house, where Thomas quickly snaps him out of it with some biting remarks. Ephraim says nothing about what he saw. Later, standing in the pouring rain and being battered by sharp gusts of wind, the two men gaze out to sea. But the ship still hasn't appeared. They head back to the lighthouse to resume their duties. Meanwhile, the storm gathers strength. At some point, the rain floods the provisions, spoiling their food. Ephraim brushes it off, figuring the ship didn't come today, but surely it will tomorrow or the next day. However, a furious Thomas disagrees. He claims it's been weeks since their shift was supposed to end. He scolds Ephraim for not rationing their food, despite repeated warnings. Calling Ephraim mad, the old man accuses him of being irresponsible. But Ephraim doesn't believe him, thinking it's just another mind game to keep him off balance. On a rainy night, they stumble outside to unearth a hidden stash of liquor buried at the base of the lighthouse. They get completely drunk. In his drunken state, Thomas recounts a story of how he lost his leg in a shipwreck. Ephraim, now growing suspicious, quietly pockets a knife from the table and catches Thomas in a lie. Something in his story doesn't add up. Thomas dismisses it, claiming Ephraim must have misheard. The night drags on, and as they keep drinking, their conversation turns into incoherent rambling. Eventually, a fight breaks out, and in a fit of rage, Thomas curses Ephraim with a haunting, ancient sea curse, one as colorful as it is terrifying. I highly recommend watching the full film to experience William Dafoe's incredible performance and the eloquence of the curse for yourself. That night, Ephraim sits at the foot of the lighthouse staircase, clutching the knife, staring longingly at the forbidden light. As dawn breaks and Thomas goes to sleep, Ephraim tries to break the lock to the lamp room with the knife, but it snaps in his hand. Frustrated, he moves to the cabinet. He manages to open it, only to find the journal missing. With his anger mounting, Ephraim sneaks into the sleeping quarters, tiptoeing toward his boss to steal the keys. Instead, he raises the knife over Thomas's sleeping form. But just then, Thomas stirs awake. Unaware of the knife, he turns over, mumbling for Ephraim to get back to work before drifting off again. Fuming with frustration, Ephraim goes outside to relieve himself, remembering the endless hours of toil, his old boss at the logging camp, and the mermaid he saw on the shore. In a fit of rage, he smashes the mermaid figurine he found earlier. From there, the days blur into a bizarre routine. Two men trapped in isolation, alternating between drinking, singing, bickering, and fighting. At one point, Ephraim confesses his darkest secret to Thomas, though the old man hardly seems interested. Ephraim reveals that his real name is actually Thomas Howard. Long ago, he almost killed his boss at the logging camp but hesitated. When his boss fell into the river, Thomas didn't save him. Instead, he let him drown and stole his identity. That's how he ended up here. But when Ephraim finishes his story, he realizes Thomas isn't even listening. In fact, he's not in the room at all. Ephraim climbs the lighthouse stairs, stepping outside to the ledge, where he sees a body lying there. When he turns it over, he's stunned to find it's his own face staring back at him. At that moment, a hand clamps down on his shoulder. He turns to see Thomas looming over him like a naked sea god, with light pouring out from his eyes directly into Ephraim's face. The next morning, Ephraim, or rather Thomas, tries to escape the island in a lifeboat. But Thomas appears wielding an axe, smashing the boat to pieces. Ephraim flees in terror. Later, back inside the lighthouse, they confront each other. Ephraim accuses Thomas of murdering the previous assistant. Thomas, in turn, tells him he's lost his mind. Maybe he's still lost in the snowy forests of Canada, tormented by guilt over the logging incident, and everything happening here is just a delusion of his fevered mind. The two continue drinking, talking nonsense in the dim, flickering light of swaying lamps as the storm rages outside. Eventually, waves crash through the windows, flooding the floor. The next morning, Ephraim discovers Thomas's logbook, filled with nothing but negative comments about his work, with a note recommending withholding his pay at the end of their shift. This revelation triggers a violent confrontation. As the fight escalates, Ephraim's mind unravels further. One moment he's seeing his old logging colleague, the next it's the mermaid, then a monstrous sea creature, and finally, Neptune himself in the form of Thomas. After beating Thomas, Ephraim forces him to crawl on all fours and bark like a dog. He leads him outside on a leash and begins to bury him alive in the hole where they'd previously hidden their liquor. Halfway through the burial, Ephraim pauses, seemingly reconsidering, only to dig up Thomas's body to retrieve the key to the lamp room. He returns to the house, but does not have time to go upstairs. Thomas catches up with him with an axe. The old man wounds the assistant, but the latter manages to stun him and kill him with the same axe. Ephraim, now covered in blood, makes his way back inside the lighthouse. With the last of his strength, Ephraim climbs the spiral staircase, unlocks the door, and collapses beside the lamp. As the lens of the lighthouse opens before him, the bright, blinding light washes over his blood-stained face. He reaches out, his expression twisted between pain and ecstasy, screaming in a mix of agony and joy, but the moment doesn't last. He loses his balance and tumbles down the stairs. In the final scene, Ephraim's lifeless body lies on the jagged rocks below, his eyes burned out, while seagulls peck at his flesh. Slowly, the scene fades into the thick fog. The Lighthouse isn't just a story about two lighthouse keepers. It's a deep dive into human nature, our fears, desires, and the boundaries of our sanity. It explores how isolation can erode the mind and what dark truths might lurk in the depths of our consciousness. This film isn't for everyone. Dark, atmospheric, and psychologically intense, it demands careful attention and deep reflection. But for those who appreciate auteur cinema and aren't afraid of plunging into a gloomy, unsettling atmosphere, this film will be a revelation. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your opinion in the comments below and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the release of new videos. Real Talk out.